I am staying on to fight the fight that Canadians elected us to do. Now is not the time for internal divisions or internal party politics. But many people have opinions on what happened in the campaign. We're going through all of that. Clearly, there are aspects that need to be improved upon. I will be making the case to our members that we need to stay united and stay focused.
Andrew Scheer today vowed to stay on as Conservative leader despite the growing criticism around his performance during the election and even calls for him to step down. So does Scheer have enough support from his caucus, from members? Is this the best strategy for the party? It's Thursday. Time to bring in At Issue, how I missed them all. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, and Paul Wells is with me here in Ottawa tonight. Good to see everybody. I'm going to start with you, Andrew, if I can. It doesn't seem as though the criticism around Scheer is going away. In fact, it seems as though people are emboldened. Like the more they hear of other people saying things, the more they feel comfortable saying something too. What do you make, I guess, of how he's handling the ratcheting up of the pressure?
Well, he's not. I mean, this is the worst possible situation for the Conservatives, where a leader who's vowing to stay and large sections of the party determined he should go, which means on present form another 6 months of this, leading quite possibly to a completely inconclusive result at the convention, where he gets something like 70-75%. Nobody can figure out whether it's enough or not. Mm-hmm. This is the nightmare scenario for them. It's to some extent this is a reflection of the way in which he was elected. He was elected as the leader as the kind of compromise choice, everybody's second choice, the guy who people could live with, be equally dissatisfied with, and on the way up, that can work. People can decide that they're willing to compromise. When you're on the downside, then everybody suddenly discovers how dissatisfied they are with you for differing reasons. So he's getting hit by both the progressive wing of the party saying you're too social conservative, the social conservatives saying you weren't social conservative enough, the Quebec wing saying you can't win. Everybody and his dog has now found a reason why they were never in favor of his leadership. And that's not a very good situation for him.
And the response today, Chantal, didn't seem, or I don't know, maybe you can't admit that you're aware of that, but it seemed to be sort of as though he was living on a different planet than the one I'm observing.
Yes, and that doesn't make it true. You can repeat something forever and it doesn't help. Most of the criticism comes from every single quarter of the party. Something called a Scheer loyalist is really hard to find, and when you're deputy leader in the House of Commons, which presumably would be the person that would have the party's back in the House while you're trying to campaign for your own job, is someone who has spent more time on the Liberal benches than on the Conservative benches. It also does not speak to a very strong palace guard on the inside. I think part of the problem is that as Conservatives are well aware, even many of the people who voted Conservative voted for the party, but very few of them said, I'm really voting for Andrew Scheer because that's who has brought me to say this is the party I want, and I'm not sure you can fix that.
Paul, what do you make of it?
If there are Scheer loyalists, and if there are Conservatives at a minimum, even if they're not Scheer loyalists, people who are perfectly happy to have him as the leader because they're bedrock Conservative loyalists, they should show up tomorrow night at the United Conservative Party convention in Calgary, where the Alberta provincial base of the Conservative movement is going to be gathered. If he gets a good reception there, that might help. So far, we've mostly heard from Toronto-based Conservatives who backed other candidates and my colleagues in the press gallery. I hasten to add, we haven't heard from almost anyone in the Conservative Party who supports him. If that were to continue tomorrow night, if we were to go through this weekend and it was going to be an eerie silence in the convention hall in Calgary, then I think that would suggest that basically nobody in the party has his back, and he would be in even bigger trouble than he is tonight.
I mean, we're hearing a couple of things that John Baird, who had been tasked with doing this post-mortem, has finished it, and the conclusions are Andrew Scheer doesn't have a great number of leadership skills and people aren't that happy with him. I guess that'll be public at some point, and that people have said to Scheer, you might want to think about what you want to do over the Christmas break. And that's obviously come from people beside him and critics. So is that what we're headed towards? Someone who is feeling the pressure ratchet up so much that they has to leave before April?
The reason why this all seems to be happening in fast forward.
Yes.
And we have been watching a pylon. is because of the minority status of the government and the fact that an election is not going to be in 4 years at a set date that you can predict in advance. And so, yes, we have all heard the same things.
Yeah.
Basically, there is some consensus amongst people who are not just the press gallery or people in Toronto, but many people who were identified very closely to Stephen Harper, for instance, and who have fought those battles, that Scheer should not be allowed to go on until April in a battle that he will emerge from even weaker than he is going in, and that ideally he should be gone by the end of the year. Whether that happens or not, whether that's wishful thinking, I can't tell you. But for sure, that is the goal.
Or something has to change. Like something has to markedly change in the way he's approaching things, Andrew, if he plans to hang on.
Yeah, I don't think there's much he can really change. I mean, there's a lot of things the party has to change. He is a symptom rather than a cause of a lot of the conservative weakness. Their failure to define themselves, their unwillingness to say what they stand for because they're afraid they can't actually sell it. And some of the things that people are criticizing Scheer for are exactly in that pattern. So as I say, to some extent he's being unfairly blamed for this, but in and of himself, you know, there's two reasons why you might have a large base of support in the party. Either because you yourself have some compelling personal qualities that people are attached to and want to support, or because you represent some particular wing of the party. And I think what we're finding is he's got neither of those bases of support, neither in his own persona nor in terms of what he stands for within the party. And so, to echo my colleagues, you know, it's not so much the cries of his critics that's really damning him at this point, it's the silence of his supposed supporters.
Well, it makes you sort of realize, and Paul, you would be able to speak to this all too well, how good Stephen Harper was at keeping all those groups together, that coalition together. And maybe it's not a fair comparison, but it doesn't seem as though Scheer is reaching out in any way, the way Harper might have.
It's funny, I talked to a former Harper staffer about 2 years ago who said the thing that people didn't really understand is how much time he spent reconciling the various factions in the party. Look, their opponents just say all conservatives are, they're all the same, you know, but it doesn't feel that way to conservatives. And balancing off interests against interest was a preoccupation of the former prime ministers. I'm sure Andrew would say to the expense of thinking about how the country should actually be governed. Look, it helps to have more than one play in politics, and Andrew Scheer is running the same play for a third time. He won the leadership by hanging around until anxiety and concern about Maxime Bernier peaked, and then he won essentially by default. His campaign was a monument to the thought that governments defeat themselves, and he sat around waiting for Justin Trudeau to do that. And now he's waiting for what to me is an unprecedented groundswell against him to essentially die out, and there's no guarantee that that's the way it's going to go.
Yeah, and talking about things that, you know, I'm not sure. I mean, today he was talking a lot about national unity, which will bring us to this next subject. But I wasn't sure I felt the same pressure there, and I wasn't sure why he was bringing it up. So let's go there. Chrystia Freeland doing a bit of a listening tour. The new Deputy Prime Minister, she met with Premier Kenney, she met with Premier Moe. Just a taste of what those two premiers had to say.
We're looking forward to having a productive conversation today about how we can find common ground. And Albertans are looking for a fair deal, and I certainly hope we can get down to some positive conversations about how to do that.
We had a good and cordial meeting with the Deputy Prime Minister. Appreciate her making the effort to come out and engage with myself here in the province of Saskatchewan and other leaders around the nation.
Okay, I don't have much time, but it did seem to me like maybe a little slight dial down from the weeks previous. Chantal?
I think that both premiers, Kenney and Moe, needed a reason to climb down from their rhetoric in the lead up to the meeting on Monday with the other premiers, and to the reality that, well, you know, a majority in the House of Commons, Liberal, NDP, Bloc, do not think the way that they had hoped that the government would be inclined to think. And I think Chrystia Freeland has not resolved any issues, but has given them a path to climbing down, and they have taken it.
Paul?
One thing we've seen is that it's almost always a good idea to have a meeting. If the opposite, if the alternative is to let that person stew by themselves and brood over how they're being snubbed. I think one thing that students of the Trudeau Prime Ministership will take away is that never again should a Prime Minister be their own intergovernmental affairs minister, because inevitably that means they don't have one.
Yes. Andrew?
I think this is mostly positioning. I agree with Chantal. They're climbing down in rhetorical terms. I don't think you're going to see them climbing down in terms of the substance of their positions.
Sure.
But you don't want to overplay your hand in politics, and you don't want to be seen to be the bad guy, to be the intransigent one. So it was an opportunity for them to sound a little more statesmanlike. No doubt, probably in the meeting, she probably rubs them a little less badly the way that Trudeau would. She probably is a bit better at the diplomatic arts, having dealt with Trump. But we'll see how long this peace lasts, because I don't think, to take up a point we made last time, I don't think she's got a lot she can offer them.
Although, you know, when you have Doug Ford acting as sort of the great unifier of the country, I would imagine that inspires...
That's how much trouble we're in.
I would imagine that inspires Jason Kenney to say, whoa. Just last thought on that, Chantal. What does that meeting next week, what needs to happen there at that Premier's meeting?
They need to come out of it not looking like they're a bunch of cats and dogs that were thrown together for an afternoon. So they're going to have to try really hard to find some common ground. In federal, provincial politics, that usually means finding something that they can all agree on that Ottawa is doing wrong.
What might that be, Andrew, do you think?
More money. It's almost always some combination of money and powers. Yeah. And I agree with Chantal, that's the only thing they can usually agree on.
Last word to you, Paul.
Every premier who's come to Justin Trudeau in the last month complaining about equalization has been told by the Prime Minister, look, there's no problem here. You guys agree among yourselves as among premiers and tell me what the solution is. It's a devilish response.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. That was a good one. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to At Issue, the podcast, for extra content. This week, we're going to look ahead briefly to next week's throne speech. Look for it on iTunes, any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational.